Good afternoon. This is an encore presentation of a talk I gave for the Port-Avood Center on the 4th of November. Because I speak extemporaneously, there will be some slight differences between that talk and this one, but the content is all the same. My theme here is the archaeology of Achaemenid Persian rule in Egypt, the subject of my recent book. Of course, this is an opportunity for self-aggrandizement, as all good scholarship is. As most of you know, ancient Egyptian chronology is divided into kingdoms and periods, kingdoms being times of political unity in Egypt, whereas periods are times of political disunity. This system breaks down in the period that interests us here, the late period. Interestingly, even though the late period is called a period, it actually is comprised of several stretches of political unity. First, the Saite dynasty of the 26th dynasty, according to Manetho, and then our period, the Achaemenid period, or 27th dynasty. And then, in the 4th century BC, there are several more periods of political unity, native Egyptian rulers. And then there is a brief period, a brief resumption of Persian rule in the 330s BC, known as the Second Persian period. And I mention this for a couple of reasons. First, just to alert you to the fact that the late period is already somewhat marginalized in Egyptological thought, which is why it's labeled a period and not a kingdom, as it probably ought to be. And secondly, because I'm apt to use terms like Saite and Achaemenid indiscriminately here, and now you know what I'm talking about. Our period, the 27th dynasty, runs from approximately 526 to 404 BC. And most of what we'll be discussing falls into this chronological span. There are several methodological challenges facing the study of the Achaemenid period in Egypt. The first of these is poor dating criteria for late period material culture. For example, as David Aston has noted, there's a tendency on the part of Egyptologists to date funerary material to the 26th dynasty, that is before the Persian period, or the 30th dynasty, that is after the Persian period, unless there is a specific reason to date something to the 27th dynasty. So material is dated earlier or later, sort of by default. Second, much of the evidence for this period is equivocal. We read Uja-Horesnet's inscription, or Herodotus, or the verso of the Demotic Chronicle. We don't find proof, we simply find evidence that we can use to support one interpretation or another. None of this evidence is actually probative. Third, we must contend with ancient, and by that I mean Greek, and modern, and by that I mostly mean 19th century, orientalist stereotyping of the Persians. For the Greeks, the Persian Wars were a moment of self-definition, after which they began to create an identity for themselves that stood in explicit contrast to the slavish, barbaric, effeminate Persian. When 19th century scholars were creating the modern study of ancient history, they found these ancient Greek prejudices to be very much in keeping with their own ideas about the contemporary Middle East. So we find these ancient and modern stereotypes sort of baked into our historical narratives of the Persian period in Egypt. As an example, let's have a look at the satrap stela, now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. This stela dates to the very early Ptolemaic period. It is actually called the satrap stele because according to the inscription, Ptolemy is still presenting himself as the governor or satrap of Egypt on behalf of Alexander IV, although it's fairly clear from the content of the inscription that he already has royal pretensions. The inscription refers to a figure named Qababash, whom we know from other sources was a rebel against the Persians around 340 or the early 330s. And according to the inscription, he is restoring temple donations that were revoked by somebody who is called in the text enemy Kesheresh. Now, Kesheresh is very similar to the Egyptian pronunciation of the name of Xerxes. But there's 150 years between the reign of Xerxes in the first half of the 5th century and Qababash. So this probably isn't referring to Xerxes. Another theory is that it's a reference to Artaxerxes, but in fact the names Xerxes and Artaxerxes are not so similar in Egyptian as they are in Greek or English. Another issue with the stela is that it refers to the return of the sacred images of the gods which were found within Asia. Scholars have interpreted this as a reference to Ptolemy returning Egyptian temple statues that were looted by the Persians. But the history of Ptolemy's military campaigns in the years after the death of Alexander don't actually bear this out. He is not known to have campaigned any further east than Syria. That is, he didn't go to any of the former Persian capitals where such booty would have been taken. So, modern scholars read this stela as evidence of the nastiness of Persian rule in Egypt, but in fact what we have here is propaganda on the part of Ptolemy, not a straightforward historical document. The tendency to emphasize the negative aspects of Achaemenid rule and the minimalist aspects are part of what Margaret Root has dubbed the politics of meagerness, in which she notes that the commentary on the Persian Empire in the West tends to stress the very feebleness of discernible impact of Persian culture on the conquered areas. And she identifies two causes, two explanations for this tendency. The first is that there's the theory, the widespread theory of Persian tolerance of local institutions and traditions. The second explanation is somewhat more insidious, and that is this idea that the Persian Empire had no traditions of its own. It had no culture. Basically, it had nothing worth imposing on any conquered peoples. What I'd like to do here is take Margaret Root's perceptive comments as a starting point and examine the politics of meagerness in Achaemenid Egypt. And I would like to do this across three categories of material, namely statuary, coinage, and drinking vessels. We'll begin with statuary. The classic work on Egyptian late period statuary is by Katibossa, and published in 1936. And in this book, she dates numerous statues to probably 26th dynasty, without any sort of explanation of why she thinks they belong to this period and not the 27th. And in fact, many of them have no particular reason why they ought to be dated to this period. The example you see here in the Egyptian Museum in Turin has no iconographic features that compel a 26th dynasty date or rule out a 27th dynasty date. And the inscription similarly does not provide any definitive chronological indicators one way or another. Yet Balsa's characterization of an abundance of statuary in the 26th dynasty and a relative lack of material in the 27th has become part of the standard narrative for this period. Thus, we find in this 1997 article by Josephson perhaps the clearest example of this. He notes there was a marked reduction of building activity in work and sculptural workshops. And he goes on to say the Persian invasion must have caused a major disruption. And it seems inconceivable that sculptural workshops would have been at work during this invasion, or as a result of this invasion. And then he uses the relative paucity of sculpture as proof of this. This is perhaps the clearest example of circular reasoning one could find in a work of scholarship. In fact, there's a great deal of material that could date to the 27th dynasty. The examples I have here on the screen are not the result of exhaustive research, but actually the result of an hour's effort when I realized I ought to include some more examples. They're very easy to find. All of these sculptures could date to the 27th dynasty or the 26th. There is nothing about any of them that compels an earlier or a later date. So we don't have an absence of material from the 27th dynasty. We simply can't distinguish it from the material from the 26th dynasty. And that's very interesting. What that indicates is that we have identities on the part of Egyptians and the part of sculpture-buying Egyptians that are indistinguishable from those in the 26th dynasty. And I'm going to use a couple of case studies here to demonstrate what I mean. Now, most Egyptian sculptures from this period are neophorous sculptures. That is, they're depicted holding these little shrines which house gods to which the statues are devoted. And these are all personal votives. These are dedicated by individuals in order to sort of serve as eternal proxies for them. They also contain biographical inscriptions. And I say biographical there in quotes because they're not really biographies. They're actually just lists of one's accomplishments and moral virtues, some of which are quite generic. So these sculptures are meant to be individual. They have to reflect an individual's identity, even if in many respects they show features of idealization and, of course, can be generic in certain ways. I'd like to focus on these two individuals, Horwejda and Ptah-hotep. Horwejda has the title Minister of Finance during the reign of King Darius, and Ptah-hotep has a title translated as Overseer of the Treasury. Now, this is probably the temple treasury in the Temple of Ptah in Memphis, but also in the reign of Darius. So what we have here are two high-ranking financial officials who are contemporaries, and yet they've made very different decisions as to what to include in their statues, which suggests that they have very different identities. Ptah-hotep's statue, you'll see here, features this long garment with sleeves, and it's actually two garments. There's the sleeve jacket is actually tucked into the long kilt, and you can sort of see it pulled up around his armpits where there's a fold there. This garment is sometimes actually called the Persian garment, and that is because of its apparent resemblance to the garment worn by the Persians, most notably the great king, in the reliefs from the Apadana at Persepolis. You'll see from the image here that the king wears this ankle-length garment with these wide flaring sleeves. And in fact, This is probably what Persians in Egypt wore. And in fact, in the famous statue of Darius that was excavated at Susa, but not very definitely made in Egypt, we can see the Persian garment, the Persian court garb sculpted in the round with the flaring sleeves, the belt in the front. So the idea here is that Ptah-hotep has adopted this garment in his statue because it's consistent with his identity as part of the Persian administration of Egypt. We also see the Persian court garment, court robe, in Egypt itself on the statue of Darius from Susa, which was very clearly made and originally set up in Egypt. And once again, you can see the flaring sleeves and the belt, which hitches up the robe in the front. Now, Ptah-hotep's combination of garments is somewhat different from this Persian court garment, but it is definitely evocative of it. And so it seems here that he has chosen to be represented wearing this garment because it best reflects his identity as a part of the Persian administration of Egypt. Similarly, he wears a torque around his neck, which it's decorated with ibex heads. And of course, these are a well-known feature of Achaemenid jewelry, as you see on the armlet from the Oxus treasure in the British Museum. This does not mean that Ptah-hotep owned such a necklace, but it does indicate once again that he is constructing his identity in this sculpture in the context of Persian material culture. Horwejda, by contrast, chooses to be depicted in a traditionally Egyptian manner. And I've included a statue from the Saite period as a comparison to show you that he's definitely making traditional choices. He's shirtless, he's wearing a kilt, which is sort of the national costume of ancient Egypt, and he's wearing a bag wig. Horwejda is defining his identity completely in Egyptian terms. Despite the fact that he and Ptah-hotep occupied almost identical, well, not quite identical, Horwejda was probably the senior of the two. He occupies a high position in the Persian administration of Egypt. The fact that these two individuals construct their identities so differently, and that these differences are reflected in their sculpture, is partly why we don't necessarily see such an obvious shift in the sculpture of Achaemenid Egypt. Most people, it seems, took Horwejda's path and presented themselves primarily in Egyptian terms. Now let's move on to coinage. Coins are another example of evidence for the Persian rule in Egypt that is not necessarily clearly Persian in nature. Coins begin to appear in Egypt in the 5th century BC. That is, they coincide with the advent of Persian rule. The only exception to this, IGCH 1632, could actually still date to the Persian period, but the coins were not published well enough for us to know. The rest of these hoards, however, pretty clearly belong to the Persian period. And what's especially interesting is that they are all Greek coins. Now, the reason for the arrival of Greek coins probably has to do with the imposition of tribute on Egypt by the Persians. According to Herodotus, the 6th province of the empire, which includes Egypt, paid 700 talents of silver in tribute per year. Now, we don't know where Herodotus gets this number. We don't have any way of checking its accuracy, But what is interesting is that he specifies that the tribute is paid in silver. Egypt has very few natural sources of silver. In fact, its main source of wealth is grain. So the Egyptians had to convert grain into silver. The Persians, of course, are not interested in grain because, first of all, it's a long way to transport grain from Egypt to the Persian heartland, which you see circled here on the map. Grain has a low cost or low value for its bulk, so it would be prohibitively expensive to ship it overland. Second, Mesopotamia is also very fertile, so if the Persians did have any great need for grain, they could have gotten it much closer to home. Third, there is no megacity at the center of the Persian Empire. In the Roman Empire, for example, Rome was a city of 500,000, and in fact the Roman province of Egypt paid its tribute in grain. But none of the Persian capitals were anywhere near that big, so there simply wasn't a need for that much grain. Thus the Persians required their tribute to be paid in silver, and the Egyptians had to find a way to convert grain into silver. And they did this by exporting grain to the Greeks. Now the coins that we find in Egypt initially are from a whole range of hoards all over the Greek, or a whole range of mints from all over the Greek world. But after the middle of the 5th century, the Athenian tetradrachm predominates. Now, there are a few reasons for this. First, this is the period of Athens' empire. The Athenian population is at its largest, and many Athenians who would normally be farming the land are manning the triremes. So the Athenians have a greater need for grain in this period than they ever did before. Another factor is that the Athenian tetradrachm is actually the main export of Athens. The Laurian silver mines in Attica were extremely rich, and the Athenians exported this coin essentially so that it became widely used throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Moreover, its types and weight never changed, so it was very useful as a sort of international currency, kind of the way the dollar is in many parts of the world today. In Egypt, it seems that the Athenian tetradrachm was actually treated as a coin. And this is in contrast to the other Greek coins, which you can see in the image here. They're usually in pretty mutilated condition. They've been treated like bullion. So if you need to make a smaller amount of silver, you cut up the coin. Or if you're not sure that it's actually silver all the way through, you make a test cut. But the Athenian tetradrachm wasn't treated this way, suggesting that the Egyptians had some faith in it. And in fact, by the end of the 5th century, we find references in Egyptian documents to Athenian tetradrachms being integrated into the Egyptian weight system. So the example here is from a Demotic ostracon from the Karga Oasis from Ain Manawir. And the text here says, "If I do not carry out the obligations written out above, I will give you 5 staters, which equals 1 deben of silver, worth 5 staters." Now, stater is a Greek term for a large denomination coin, and in other documents from Ain Manawir, it's specifically called the stater of Ionia. Ionia is the standard Egyptian and Near Eastern term for a Greek. So these are probably references to Athenian tetradrachms, and in fact 5 Athenian tetradrachms weigh pretty close to 1 Egyptian deben. So here you have a contract saying that a deben of silver is acceptable, but so is 5 staters. You have the stater basically adopted as an Egyptian weight. In this same period, we also see the beginning of the minting of imitation Athenian tetradrachms in Egypt. Now, when I say imitations, I do not mean counterfeits. These coins weigh the same as Athenian tetradrachms. They have the same types, the same legends. They just have some stylistic differences. But even so, you'll find that the stylistic differences seem to follow whatever changes are being made to at the mint in Athens. Thus, you have pie-style imitation tetradrachms introduced in Egypt not long after this style of coin is introduced in Athens. After the Peloponnesian War, the Athenians were exporting fewer coins, and they're certainly importing less grain. And so the money supply in Egypt fell. Thus, the Egyptians began making their own Athenian tetradrachms from their own silver. We even have epigraphic evidence from Athens that the Athenians appointed public slaves to check foreign coins coming into Athens to make sure that they were actually the appropriate weights and types to circulate here. And this phenomenon continues throughout the 4th century into the Second Persian period, where we have another innovation, namely the introduction of imitation Athenian tetradrachms naming King Artaxerxes III in Demotic. You see 2 examples there on the top. And we also have coins naming the last 2 satraps or governors of Egypt, Sabakis and Mazakis, in Aramaic. And those 2 coins on the bottom are actually very interesting because Aramaic is the administrative language of the Persian Empire. And so these coins are, in essence, the official issues, even though they're still imitation Athenian tetradrachms, because they are minted by the Persian governors of Egypt. They are essentially local legal tender. And this illustrates the extent to which the Athenian tetradrachm has been integrated into the economy of Egypt as a result of Achaemenid rule. Our third case involves drinking vessels, in particular phialae and rhyta, which are types of drinking vessels closely associated with the Achaemenid royal court, which in fact we find in Egypt. Here we have examples of a faience rhyton, just the fragments of the 4 parts, which is very clearly an Egyptian product because faience is one of the favorite media of ancient Egyptian craftsmen. And the phialae here are silver. We have one from the Tel El Mashkuta hoard, which reportedly comes from the eastern Nile Delta. And then 3 excavated examples from Tel Timai, ancient Thmuis, which are often dated later, but the form is very clearly Achaemenid. So these vessels are evidence of Achaemenid impact because they are, as I said, closely associated with the Achaemenid royal court. The rhyton is a classic Persian drinking vessel. You can think of it as being a sort of drinking horn. The shape usually combines a horn-shaped beaker with a sculpture of an animal or some other sort of creature. And this combines 2 different Near Eastern traditions. First of the animal-headed beakers that we see in the Neo-Assyrian Empire and in Iron Age Anatolia. And second, the animal-shaped vessels that are so characteristic of the Iranian Iron Age. They've been brought together in the Achaemenid rhyton, of which we have a magnificent example here, featuring a protome in the form of a horned griffin, which is, of course, a classic example of Achaemenid iconography, which is why these are so often associated with the Achaemenid court. The fiale, or the Achaemenid fiale to be precise, since the word fiale is actually a generic Greek term for any shallow bowl. The Achaemenid fiale is a wide, shallow bowl, usually with lobes and other sorts of floral decoration. And these are also closely associated with the Achaemenid court, in part because of this set of 4 vessels that have inscriptions in Old Persian naming King Artaxerxes. And in fact, these inscriptions specify that these vessels were made at the royal court. So these are essentially royal drinking vessels for use at the royal table. A third kind of drinking vessel is usually called the Achaemenid bowl. And this is usually a deep bowl with a carinated shoulder and an outturned rim. And you have some nice silver examples here. And I should be clear that this lovely photo is staged. All of these vessels are in the British Museum, but they certainly do not all come from the same context. The Achaemenid bowl is so called because it appears in the reliefs on the Apadana at Persepolis, where it is carried by delegations from across the empire. So here we have one delegation, probably from Lydia or Syria. Those are the guys with the hats that make them look like they're members of Devo. And on the other we have the Arachosians or Drangians, who are from the eastern part of the empire. And yet they're both carrying Achaemenid bowls. And this has led to scholars interpreting these as symbols of imperial unity. Because you'll notice that the figures are all wearing unique costumes, and they are bringing unique animals. The people from the Eastern Empire are leading a camel, which is a creature native to Central Asia. But the bowls are marking their identity as members of the Achaemenid Empire. So the Achaemenid bowl, which is probably also a drinking vessel since it is carried along with other drinking paraphernalia, such as the table amphoras that you see being carried by the Lydians there. The Achaemenid bowl is a marker of Achaemenid imperial identity. Not necessarily of the royal court the way Philae and Rhaeta are, but definitely associated with participation in the Achaemenid imperial project. Which is why it's so interesting that we find them in Egypt. In fact, we find them at many different sites in a variety of different media, including ceramics, silver, bronze. There's a glass example there from Cyrenaica, which, according to Herodotus, is administered as part of Egypt. And the ceramic examples from Tel Defena there are interesting because they have ring bases, which is an adaptation of the Achaemenid bowl. It's been, the form has been altered to meet the needs of the Egyptians using them. What these vessels suggest is that in Egypt, various people adopted aspects of Achaemenid material culture and integrated it into something quite intimate, which is their dining practices. Now, it's possible that some of these bowls were owned by people who simply regarded them as fashionable or modish or interesting. But the fact that we find them around Egypt, as indeed we do various other places across the empire, suggests that there are Egyptians who are very much participating in certain aspects of Achaemenid material culture. And we can go further still with this relief from the stela of Jed Herbes, where we see an individual who may be exhibiting his knowledge of Persian table manners. It's somewhat clear in the line drawing here. You see a figure dressed in the Persian court garb, sitting in a chair, which looks very much like the chair used by the great king at the Apadana at Persepolis. And he has a long beard, like a Persian. And he's holding a drinking vessel on his fingertips. This is very awkward, but it also seems to fit other iconographic examples of Achaemenid drinking practice, especially as attested on seals. On the top here we have a drawing of a seal impression from the Persepolis fortification archive, where you have an individual, again sitting in a chair, holding a drinking vessel in front of his face, and you can just make out that it is perched on his fingertips. The guy in front of him holding a fly swatter may actually be holding a strainer and is about to serve wine. Down below, we have an impression of a cylinder seal in Zurich, which sort of fleshes out the line drawing above, where you can see once again a seated drinker, and you can see his table and his drinking paraphernalia there, once again holding the bowl perched on his fingertips. And in fact, according to Xenophon in the Cyropaedia, which is admittedly a literary as much as a historical work, there's actually a reference to King Cyrus learning the proper way to convey a bowl of wine on the fingertips. So this image on the stela of Jed Herbes suggests that in addition to actual Achaemenid bowls coming to Egypt, there is also some knowledge of and some use of Persian drinking practices, and in particular a Persian mode of courtly drinking. The stela of Jed Herbes is very interesting because it has this image of a man who is very clearly dressed as a Persian, presenting himself as a Persian. This is a funerary stela that was excavated at Saqqara in 1994. And unfortunately it was found in a secondary context, so we don't have a tomb that was associated with it. The inscriptions, well actually let me start with the imagery. The imagery has the scene at the bottom of the seated individual, who is probably Jed Herbes, the deceased, in front of an offering table. And above him we have a classic Egyptian scene of embalming with the god Anubis. The inscriptions, which are hieroglyphic and demotic, shed further light on Jed Herbes. They include a fairly standard extract of a fairly standard Egyptian prayer for the dead, but we also have Jed Herbes' parents' names, which are Artam and Tanofrether. Tanofrether is a perfectly good Egyptian name. Artam is not. In fact, it is probably an Iranian name, which has led scholars to suggest that Jed Herbes was the son of a Persian father and an Egyptian mother. This then would account for his specific interest in portraying himself with a Persian identity, even in his funerary stela, and also for his detailed knowledge of Persian drinking practices. But he probably wasn't alone. And in fact, we should expect there to be many others like him, the children of mixed marriages. And it's worth remembering as well that names are not necessarily indicators of ethnicity. Just because Jed Herbes' father is named Artam does not in fact make him a Persian. In this period we see all sorts of mixed names within single families. Persian names, Egyptian names, Jewish names, all mixed together in individual families in the Demotic and the Aramaic papyri. What's interesting too is that there seems to be a memory of these Persian drinking vessels even after the end of Persian rule in Egypt. And for that, the tomb of Petasiris is particularly interesting. The tomb is at Tuna el Jebel, and it dates to the last quarter of the 4th century BC, that is, after Alexander has arrived and made Egypt part of his empire, and most likely after Alexander has died and Ptolemy has taken over. The tomb is in the form of a small temple, and it's covered with reliefs, as Egyptian tombs are. The autobiographical inscription makes reference to the ruler of foreign lands, which is normally a way for Egyptians to refer to a foreign invader. And the inscription makes things sound pretty grim. Nothing was in its former place. Fighting had started in Egypt, the south being in turmoil, the north in revolt, and so on. Now, as with the sculptures, the statues discussed earlier, this is not necessarily an indicator of actual historical conditions, but it is nevertheless fairly clear that Petasiris is alluding to the turmoil of the Second Persian period. Yet in the reliefs on his tomb, we actually have images of Persian drinking vessels being manufactured, including a rhyton and an Achaemenid fiale. This suggests that even through the period of Egyptian rule in the 4th century and the turmoil of the Second Persian period and Alexander's invasion, that the Egyptians continued to associate these Persian drinking vessels with elite status. In fact, Petasiris probably does not think of these as explicitly Persian vessels, but rather as the sorts of things that elite people drink with. And this interpretation is borne out by the fact that we have a number of rhyta and fialae, and indeed Persian bowls, from Hellenistic Egypt, and indeed various other places in the Hellenistic Mediterranean. So these vessels had become part of Egyptian drinking culture. They'd been integrated into Egyptian dining practices, at least at a very elite level. So when we think about the politics of meagerness in Achaemenid Egypt, we find that actually there is a great abundance of evidence for the impact of Achaemenid rule. Just because a statue does not have any clear indicators of Persianness does not actually mean that it doesn't belong to the Persian period, and in fact it may just tell us that the individual involved, the individual who commissioned it, continues to see himself as an Egyptian. Likewise, we have other adaptations of Persian material culture, or indeed side effects of Persian material culture, such as the adoption of coinage. And I suspect that the reason Achaemenid impact is so difficult to find is not because of the feebleness of Persian rule, but it has to do with Achaemenid ideology. So here we have an extract of the inscription on the tomb of Darius at Naxxurustam, as well as an image of the facade of the tomb of Xerxes at the same place. And in this inscription, you have Darius declaring, "I am Darius, the great king, king of kings, king of countries containing all kinds of men, king on this great earth far and wide." And later he says that if you look at the tomb facade and wonder how many peoples the great king ruled, you will see them all there. And indeed, if you look at the image, you will see that we have the peoples of the empire, all clearly labeled, and all wearing distinctive local costumes. For the Persians, to be king of kings, you had to maintain the integrity of all the local cultures that were part of your empire. Otherwise, you wouldn't be king of kings anymore. And this is why the Persians seemingly had no pressure, did not pressure subject peoples to assimilate, to become Persian. Rather, they wanted them to maintain those local identities because that was how the Persians understood empire. The fact that so many Egyptians did adopt aspects of Persian culture, such as drinking, suggests just how strong the appeal of Persian culture was for the Egyptian subjects of the empire. Thank you.